Coming up on Talking Points, Russian forces have moved into northern Syria following a U.S. withdrawal from the region. The details on how this will impact Kurdish fighters. And back home, key figures testified before House investigators as the impeachment inquiry into President Trump continues. We break down the new information and what it means for the president. And Talking Points anchor Jack Watson sits down with SU professor Margaret Susan Thompson for a look at the history of presidential impeachment in the United States. All that and more ahead. This is Talking Points. Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Conor Wight. We begin tonight in Syria. A ceasefire agreement between the U.S. and Turkey was an attempt to create a safe zone between Turkish and Kurdish forces. But according to CNN, two U.S. officials say the ceasefire isn't holding and that both sides are claiming that the other is violating the agreement. Meanwhile, Russian forces in Syria have stepped in to fortify the northern border. Talking Points analyst Haley Vaughan says the shift of forces in the region gives Russia an opportunity to gain more power in the Middle East. Haley?
Russian President Vladimir Putin is scheduled to meet with Turkish leader Erdogan in Sochi tomorrow to discuss the removal of Kurdish military in towns along the Syria-Turkey border. This meeting takes place the same day the 5-day deal between the Turks and the Kurds is set to expire. Although the deal demands a halt in military action, both Turkey and the Kurds have accused each other of breaking the deal. CNN reports that as soon as the U.S. began its withdrawal from the conflict, Russia started mediating negotiations between the Kurds and Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. According to CBS News, the SDF has ceded Kurdish territory to Syria in exchange for support from Assad's Russian-backed troops. Russia has long been a key ally of Assad's in the civil war. Due to the increased presence of Russian forces and the lack of opposing American power, Assad's regime is almost certain to grow stronger. After President Donald Trump's abrupt withdrawal from American forces, Russia is left as the only major country with both troops and political power in Syria, which they can now use to influence policy in the Middle East for the foreseeable future.
Haley, thank you. We're also joined here by Michael Fernari to help break all this down. So what can you both tell me about Trump's seeming reversal of policy in the region?
So the president has faced bipartisan backlash after his withdrawal of the troops. Many fear that the withdrawal will lead to a resurgence of ISIS, and now he said that he'll leave about 200 to guard the oil fields from the caliphate.
And so as far as the withdrawal goes in general, there's going to be 200 troops remaining to kind of try to see if they can stamp out ISIS. And this decision came after a lot of backlash, both from advisors and from Mitch McConnell, who denounced the move. Seems like President Trump's policy is kind of getting tugged a little bit back towards the center after that backlash.
Right. Looking at the long term, there are concerns that ISIS could resurge. And of course, we have a long history of violence in the region. Turkey's gone as far to say that our former allies, the Kurds, are a terrorist group as opposed to anything else. What can we look at in terms of a long-term peace agreement, if at all?
Well, it really seems like it's kind of up to Russia's ability to broker the deal. And the Kurds really don't have much bargaining power right now, as Russia's main priority is a unified Syria.
And what can we expect in the short term? What can we expect in the coming days?
So as Haley mentioned, Erdogan is going to be meeting with Putin tomorrow. Putin's really going to be in the driver's seat of this agreement. And so on the ground, what we're seeing, the agreement, of course, does expire tomorrow, but according to Reuters, the Kurds and the Turks have been in some communication to try to make sure they don't bump into each other in the meantime before some agreement gets reached. So the ceasefire expiring tomorrow does not mean that a bloodbath is on the way.
Certainly a tricky situation. We'll have to see if any more sanctions come based on what comes over the next coming days. Michael, Haley, thank you so much. There have been multiple major developments in the Ukraine scandal over the past week. Both Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and a former advisor to Mike Pompeo testified before Congress. Meanwhile, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney raised alarm bells when he suggested there actually may have been quid pro quo between Trump and Ukraine. Talking Points analyst Brandon Ross joins us in studio to walk us through what we've learned. Brandon?
Conor, the last week in testimony has certainly revealed quite a bit, so let's start with America's ambassador to the EU and Gordon Sondland. Politico published a copy of Sondland's opening remarks from last week, and in it he says Giuliani made overtures to Ukraine at President Trump's request. could be big because if true, two of Giuliani's associates that helped him with Ukraine were recently charged with campaign finance violations. Later in the week, a former aide to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo testified, and that's Michael McKinley. He's a career State Department employee who recently stepped down. The New York Times reports the reason behind this resignation were twofold. McKinley reportedly said that the first related to the lack of support for foreign service employees that were caught up in this scandal. The second was, and I quote, what appears to be the utilization of our ambassadors to advance a domestic political objective. Then, to cap it all off, there was this shocking statement from White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney that he later had to take back.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. I'm talking to Mr. Carl. That is going to happen. Elections have consequences.
Certainly an explosive comment, and we have Augustus LaRue here to help break all of this information down. Now, Mick Mulvaney's comments seem to be the biggest one from last week. What can we really, what can we actually understand from what he said with the words quid pro quo?
Well, right now we're seeing the Democrats seeing this as another opportunity to push for further calls for impeachment, especially over the last week. Among those currently calling for impeachment were Democratic Congressmen Jerry Connolly, Adam Schiff, and Stephen Lynch. Now, again, continuing this push, many of them viewed Mick Mulvaney's statements as both incriminating and very damning towards the president. Stephen Lynch, as a matter of fact, currently calling for a subpoena to Mick Mulvaney to further push on this issue and apply more pressure to the president in the hopes of finding any more information that they can dig up from this recent soundbite.
Now, Rudy Giuliani seems to have taken center stage here. We know that he was involved. To what extent was he involved?
So, according to the testimony from Gordon Sondland, he actually was sort of already running a sort of shadow foreign policy on this issue, and actually, like, at President Trump's direction, pushed for this sort of probe into the 2016 election. That's what President Trump allegedly talked with Volodymyr Zelensky about on that famous phone call now from all the way back this summer. So Giuliani is a central player here, and especially with the fact that he is currently being investigated in the same case that his associates have already been charged in, that is definitely something to keep an eye out for.
Now, very quickly here, what kind of testimonies can we expect in the near future?
Well, we actually have a number of testimonies that we can look forward to this week in terms of where this investigation will go. I believe we do have some that we can show you up on the screen. If not, well, this Tuesday, first and foremost, we do have the former charge d'affaires that will be taking the stand this Tuesday, who will be, bear in mind, was the former head of the embassy, U.S.'s embassy in Ukraine, rather, who was involved in those highly publicized texts between Gordon Sondland and Kurt Volker. Moving on to Wednesday, we also have to look forward to Philip Rieker taking the stand, the former acting assistant secretary of the State of the EU and Eurasian Affairs. And then also to keep a keen eye out on Michael Duffy that same day, Wednesday, the former associate director of the National Security Programs at the Office of Management and Budget, who was the individual that officially gave the authority to stall aid to Ukraine around the crux of this issue.
All right, guys, thank you so much. This isn't America's first presidential impeachment. For a historical view of the impeachment, Talking Points anchor Jack Watson sat down with Maxwell professor Margaret Susan Thompson to talk about impeachment.
We're very glad to be joined today by Professor Margaret Susan Thompson from the Maxwell School. She teaches political science here at SU. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
It's good to be here.
Hopefully for some much-needed historical context on the current impeachment inquiry and a potential impeachment of the president that we're going through. What historical precedent do we have for impeachment here?
Well, we've had 2 presidents impeached in the past, and it's important also to realize that impeachment does not mean removal. Impeachment is sort of the equivalent to an indictment. So if a president or anyone else is impeached, it means they're indicted. The trial takes place in the Senate and requires a 2/3 majority.
The argument, if you look to the side here and see the subpoenas that the president has been issued in the past couple of weeks from Cy Vance here in the state of New York, Manhattan District Attorney, the argument is that the only way to accuse the president of a crime is through impeachment. You can't subpoena him. That's the argument from their lawyers.
That is an opinion that has never been tested, but it is a tradition that has been respected, and there's no evidence that it wouldn't be respected this time. However, it is true that there are state-level charges that could be brought against either President Trump or the Trump organization.
So if we were to sort of go back in time a little bit, and bring things back to the 1990s, the late 1990s, with President Clinton's...
Well, let me just say one thing before we do that.
Of course.
And that's to look at the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, who came within one vote of actually being convicted. But the point I wanted to make is that eventually, long after Andrew Johnson was dead, the Tenure of Office Act was judged to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So it's important to realize that the whole impeachment and removal process is not based on the same standards as a court of law.
Do you see sort of some parallels from the divisiveness of that era to the divisiveness of today?
Yes, and I think we even saw it in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was impeached and was not convicted, and it was a much less close vote on lack of impeachment, but it was a totally partisan vote for Clinton.
Do you think we're sort of seeing something similar right now with Nancy Pelosi leading the House?
Yes and no. Clearly, it's very partisan. I think the difference is that Bill Clinton retained really high public approval ratings during the entire process. Donald Trump has never reached 50% in his entire presidency. So it's a very different era in terms of public support for at least an investigation.
What chance do you give for an actual removal?
I think something bigger is going to have to happen or come to light before the president would be removed from office. But certainly a president who comes close to being removed would be hard to reelect.
All right, well, we'll keep an eye out for that impeachment vote. If it comes in the next couple of weeks, well, we'll certainly have to see what happens there. But Professor Thompson, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Uncertainty over Brexit's future continues tonight. Parliament derailed the Prime Minister's plans after refusing to hold a vote on his new Brexit deal. We have what you need to know after the break. Don't go away.
They said a bottle was just a bottle. That no one would ever notice me. But I knew I could be more. That one day, I would make people smile.
According to national polling averages, Vice President Joe Biden is still ahead of other Democratic hopefuls seeking the party's nomination. But Elizabeth Warren is a close second, and her march towards the top was evident last week in the fourth Democratic debate. Here to break down how the debate impacted the race is Talking Points analyst Anthony Dabbundo.
Elizabeth Warren found herself in a unique position on Tuesday night. She's risen in the polls and rode favorable media coverage to surge up to Joe Biden. And while Biden hasn't necessarily lost ground individually, his poll numbers are about where they were 2 months ago. Warren became the center of attention at Tuesday's debate for the first time. Critics from her right attacked her for her Medicare for All health care plan, arguing that Warren wouldn't be able to pay for it. And Warren spoke almost 700 more words than every other candidate, and despite the attacks from fellow Democrats, saw her favorability bump up about 2 points in a panel poll that asked the same respondents both before and after the debate. Now, Warren's change in the race from surging number 2 to perceived frontrunner might be premature, but there are no signs that her surge is going to stop. She outraised every candidate besides Tom Steyer and Bernie Sanders in quarter 3 and has now outraised Biden in total 60 million to 37 million. And while Warren has always had her base of progressives and highly politically interested people, The underlying numbers show that Warren is continuing to gain in the polls from people who are just now tuning into the 2020 race. Among people who claim Biden as their first choice, 37% say Warren would be second, which is more than any other candidate. And while she's not receiving many endorsements from party elites, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying the Democrats need more moderate, sweeping policies to beat Donald Trump, Biden is still a clear favorite in the early southern states and Super Tuesday primaries like South Carolina. So while consensus is building for Warren's surge, the data shows that Warren supporters are more engaged and willing to donate, the Massachusetts senator has a chance to pull ahead of Biden.
Anthony, thank you. UK's Parliament did not hold a second vote on British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Brexit deal today. On Saturday, MPs voted to delay considering the deal, which the EU had previously agreed to. House of Commons Speaker John Bercow said Johnson's plans were no different from the plan he gave Parliament over the weekend.
Johnson presented his deal to members of Parliament on a weekend session, a rare occurrence that hasn't happened in 37 years. Johnson was forced by Parliament to ask for a Brexit extension from the EU. He was criticized for sending an unsigned letter to the EU, but is adamant that he does not want an extension and thinks he could get a vote from the government on Monday.
And to anticipate the questions that are coming from the benches opposite, I will not negotiate a delay with the EU. And neither does the law compel me to do so.
The government minister in charge of Brexit, Michael Gove, also says the UK will leave the EU by October 31st, despite members of Parliament trying to delay the process. Now, details on the Prime Minister's EU deal have not come out yet, but he says the main goal is to, quote, take back control. Some of the specifics we can expect in the new deal are that Britain will not have to follow EU laws, they will be able to strike their own free trade deals, end EU taxes on goods and services, and end EU court supremacy. There are a lot of questions about Northern Ireland right now. Johnson is saying the deal proposes that Northern Ireland will be in the UK customs territory. However, the North will still have to follow EU customs and regulations because of its shared border with the Republic of Ireland. Because of this deal, there will still be a customs check between the borders. That could be a violation of their open border agreement. Still, the hope is that easy and smooth trading will continue between the border of these two countries. Regardless of the Saturday session, the vote on the deal is expected for early this week. The EU is hoping to be notified by the UK government about their next steps as soon as possible. Connor, back to you.
Thanks, Peyton. According to the New York Times, the Chinese government is persecuting Muslim groups in the country. For about 2 years, China has been forcing millions of Muslims to assimilate to Chinese culture through detention camps and other methods. China claims the program is to help fight Islamist extremism, but The Independent highlights allegations of forced abortions and the destruction of grave sites. Here to discuss the issue are Talking Points analysts Rob Flax and Spencer Kweskin. Now, guys, obviously these are pretty extreme allegations. Why haven't we seen much of a condemnation from the international community at large?
Well, what's been happening is there has been limited action, but in terms of China's huge market sway, they really can't afford to give up too much leverage. We've seen the U.S. give a little bit of sanctions, and Europe is pledging to take away goods, but really that's the extent of it. They really can't afford to overplay their hand.
Now, here in the U.S., we have U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who has who has placed in visa bans on certain Chinese officials believed to be behind abuse, and the U.S. Department of Customs, who have also placed in export restrictions to Chinese elements that are believed to be behind abuse. So
again, we see China's vast economic power. Now, what kind of reports or evidence have we actually seen of some of the allegations of persecution happening in the country?
Right, so these abuse allegations are actually very severe. In 2018, the BBC used satellite imagery to show that China's building re-education camps that can contain up to 1 million Uyghur population members, and many of them being persecuted for religious or cultural expression. In February, the New York Times reported that China is using DNA and taking DNA from Uyghur population in order to sort of track them. And in September, the UN actually heard a case where China is taking and harvesting organs from members of the Uyghur Muslim population.
Now, it's part of allegations like this that are part of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protest. To switch gears a little bit here, what are some of the more recent developments of that protest? How has it turned over the past 7 months?
Right, well, the violence has just been ramping up. This week especially, there was a unsanctioned pro-democracy rally that turned violent. There was car bombs, there was Molotov cocktails, 24 people very seriously injured, and actually local businesses were severely damaged too, and police are saying this is a real uptick. Now, the prosecution of the Uyghurs is definitely one of the issues, but the Hong Kong protests have really just been, they've been gaining momentum. They do not want to see President Xi try to take that influence and put it back into Hong Kong, and so they're really just ramping it up, and they're hoping that this will give the international community what it needs to be able to support them.
Well, we'll certainly have to see how they respond. Spencer, Rob, thank you so much. Coming up, Parliament and the Prime Minister are up for grabs tonight in Canada. Some of the votes have already been counted. We'll have the latest next.
Hey, Hard, what's this?
That's my resignation letter.
You're resigning.
Why? Because you're constantly ignoring me. You're half as active as you used to be, and you get stuff like this. You've been putting me under a lot of pressure lately. That's why I'm ready to quit.
I forgot. I'll do better. Please.
Don't quit on me. Okay. But remember, it's not what you say. It's what you do.
Listen to your heart. Don't let it quit on you.
Let's go for a walk.
Uncontrolled high blood pressure could lead to a stroke, heart attack, or death. Get yours to a healthy range before it's too late.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl.
Leaving hot coals improperly extinguished can cause a wildfire.
Hey guys, it's Smokey!
It looks as if Smokey is going to use the drown, stir, drown, and feel technique. After the first drown, a good start. Next, another drink. And finally, a close feel.
Is it cool? Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Smokey, catch. Oh, my bad, Smokey.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Welcome back to Talking Points. We're covering some of the top stories from New York. Right now, the candidates for Onondaga County District Attorney are debating. The event, hosted by Syracuse.com, features Republican incumbent William Fitzpatrick, conservative challenger Gary Levine, and Democratic challenger Charles Keller. Fitzpatrick has served 7 terms in the position, and this is the first time in 10 years that he faces opposition. In the past, in the past debates, he talked about achievements from the past 27 years in office, including creating 8 specialized diversionary courts that are designed to handle cases for specific groups like adolescents. Conservative Gary Levine says the primary reason he's running is to unseat Fitzpatrick. He says the incumbent has abused the position, and Levine wants to restore integrity to the office. However, Syracuse.com reports that he has not offered many specifics on the campaign trail regarding policy goals. The Democratic hopeful is Charles Keller, a graduate of the SU Law program and a Syracuse-based defense attorney. Keller is running on a platform of progressive criminal justice reform and, like Levine, believes that there needs to be a change in the Onondaga County District Attorney's office. Election Day is November 5th. Moving down to New York City is planning to close down the Rikers Island jail complex in 2026. The city's Common Council approved the $8 billion plan last week in a 36-13 vote. The plan calls for replacing Rikers with 4 smaller jails spread across 4 of New York's boroughs. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio says that this is part of reforming the criminal justice system and moving away from mass incarceration, a system that studies show disproportionately impacts minorities.
There's been a cycle of incarceration. Let's be blunt about it. Never-ending cycle. A lot of good people got caught up into it. A lot of lives ruined. It did not have to be this way.
Officials say that the Rikers population dropped below 7,000 for the first time since 1980 and are projecting the jail population of New York will drop to 3,300 by 2026. Rikers is also closing in part due to reports of mistreatment, violence, and even death inside the jail. But some are criticizing the mayor's decision. The Correction Officers Benevolent Association is concerned that the new jails will only be capable of holding half of the prisoner population currently found in Rikers. Others believe that a better and less expensive option would be to simply repair and improve Rikers instead of shutting it down entirely. Moving up to Canada, today Canadians took to the polls in a general election that will ultimately decide who will become the nation's prime minister. The Canadian government uses the parliamentary system, and in a nutshell, it works like this. Canadians will vote for a member of parliament from 5 political parties to represent their riding or electoral district. The leader of the party that achieves a majority in parliament will become the prime minister and be tasked with forming the government. In a race marked by scandal, the prime minister will either be Liberal incumbent Justin Trudeau or Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, and polls indicate that the race will come down to the wire. In order to form the government, a party needs to achieve 170 seats to form a majority government. Polls indicate that it's unlikely Trudeau's Liberals or Scheer's Conservatives will achieve that amount. The most likely outcome is a coalition minority government, and it's unclear who will be tasked with its creation. Even if Trudeau's party gains less seats than his Conservative rivals, as the sitting prime minister, there is precedent set for granting Trudeau the power of forming the government. Results are starting to arrive from Atlantic Canada, where the Liberal share of the vote seems to be down while the Greens are rising. However, it is still much too early to make a judgment, and the picture will be much clearer when polls close in Quebec and Ontario in about 5 minutes. After the break, early voting is starting up across New York. We'll give you the basics of early voting in the state next on Talking Points.
Looking for these? You drive buzzed. It could be one very expensive ride.
First, you gotta make bail. Then pay me to get your car back.
Your insurance premiums will go through the roof.
And my legal fees just keep adding up. All told, it could end up costing you $10,000.
Buzzed, busted, and broke. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
You've messed up your son's haircut.
Mom?
Do you A, try to fix it?
Like it never happened.
B, work with what you got? Or C, show solidarity?
Thank you, baby.
As a parent, there are no perfect answers. But you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
Fancy pants peanut butter? A big screen television? You haven't even bought a sofa yet. A motorcycle? When your father finds out, he's gonna flip his shoes with 2 buckles? What do you even need 2 buckles for? Mr. Big Shot, buying whiskey shots for everybody in the bar. From the looks of it, I'd say nobody even remembers. Feed the pig.
Here we go. We're gonna go out there in the rain. Gonna get wet. All right, here we go. Oh, no! Okay, quick. Oh yeah, yes. So much fun. Mwah. We're getting so wet.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
For the first time, voters in Onondaga County will have the opportunity to vote early. The 9-day early voting window will begin on Saturday, October 26th to Sunday, November 3rd. Any unregistered voters can still cast a vote at their designated locations. In January, New York state legislators approved the new early voting system, and the state government is helping counties with funding. However, there's no voting on November 4th, as all the sites will be closed to prepare for the election day on November 6th. Now, New York will be joining 4 other states as well as the District of Columbia in that decision. And the fact that they're providing funding is a major help. Some counties were concerned initially when this plan came out that they would have to foot the bill, but later on it was revealed in the New York State's budget that they'd be putting up about $10 million to help counties around the state. That's all the time we have for Talking Points tonight. For more webisodes and articles, head to CitrusTV.com. News Live at 6 will have an update on those Canadian elections tomorrow. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Tune in next week for another episode of Talking Points. For all of us here, I'm Conor Wight. Have a great night, Syracuse.